Hey, folks, and welcome to the very first episode of our brand new podcast series, the Veterinary Recruitment Podcast, hosted by myself, Kieran Fletcher. Today, I am joined by my wonderful colleague, Josh. Josh, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Kieran.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So, to kick things off in today's first episode, Josh and I are going to be looking at some frequently asked questions, three in particular that we've been asked multiple times in our time on the veterinary division. So, folks, before we dive in to our questions, I think it's important you get an idea as to who Josh is. So, Josh, could you just give our listeners a little bit of a background about your work in the veterinary sector?
Certainly. So, over my time in the vet sector, I have been on both the resourcing side and very much sort of on the client side. So, traditionally, I started working solely from proactively sourcing vets, either from headhunting directly or working on our database that we've grown over the last 11 years or so. Now I do dabble a little bit in the client side, working with vets who are committed to doing things a bit of a different way, a better way when it comes to looking for a new role. I think my sort of vast knowledge in speaking with vets all day, every day, means that I'll certainly be able to answer some questions that you all have.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful. So, without further ado, let's dive in. So, our first frequently asked question that both Josh and I have regularly come across is what is the advantage of working with an independent veterinary practice over a corporate one? So, Josh, if you'd like to start us off, and I'll chime in as and where possible. But yeah, how would you normally answer that question when you face that from vets we speak to?
Certainly. So it does vary from practice to practice, and you definitely see a higher percentage of corporate practices popping up now. I think that is going to sort of move on to more independence growing, but having a vast majority of corporate practices means that they're all run slightly differently. But traditionally, corporate practices do have higher CPD allowances. So it can be great for vets, especially newer vets and new graduates that are wanting to come in and sort of learn a lot very, very quickly. Traditionally, there are sort of higher salary bandings at corporate practices than independents, and that's just due to the financial backing and the large amount of profit that corporate entities make. Um, and more often than not, there's a bit more of a set structure to the day, and it's sort of the same for every vet across the whole branch, and usually across the whole region.
Mm.
And then you've also got other benefits, such as the centralized departments, anything from payroll to HR. And having a HR department can be really, really vital, especially if you are a newer graduate vet and you have a lot of questions. And it also comes in handy if you do ever have any concerns, rather than approaching somebody senior at an independent practice who usually is a partner and it's their practice. What do you think, Kieran?
I agree with the points you've mentioned there for sure. I think, particularly for new grads that I've spoken with, there's almost this kind of, dare I say, this blanket effect around them, whereby if they are new to the veterinary profession, once they've qualified and they're actually getting working, there are a lot of advantages to being with a corporate practice um, regarding what's on offer. So the security that comes with that, the support that comes with that. It's often the more experienced vets whom I'm dealing with that tend to ask more about the independence. Now, of course, you will get new grads who do ask about joining independent practices. Um, and we'll come on to the advantages of independence shortly. But everything you've mentioned there, I do think is a strong positive for a corporate environment, a corporate
Hmm.
practice. Um, I think the higher salaries can certainly attract people, um, but naturally, with that, doesn't necessarily mean the right work-life balance, the right sort of happiness that comes from a job, which I know sounds a little cliche, but is such an important factor in this day and age. Let's be honest. Um, the set structure certainly goes well. I think people who like routine and like to have set set structures certainly benefit from being with a corporate practice, and the centralized departments that you've mentioned, particularly HR and areas like that. In the veterinary profession, it can just be uh, everything going smoothly, and then one day there might be a patient who's not particularly taken to how you've handled things very well, and to have the support of that larger corporate entity. Again, there can certainly be some positives there for the right person. Of course, it's not going to be for everybody. Um, so, how about more on the independent side of things, Josh? In your experience, what would you say are some pros and cons with that?
Yeah, so I mean, for the vast majority of independent practices, the positive, one of the big positives is that they're actually usually vet owned, and so more often than not, they're run by partners who have been in the clinical world, and have been in the both corporates more often than not,
Mm,
and sort of decide that the corporate isn't being run the way that they would run it. So they sort of break off on their own and decide to run it, which means they have a lot of hands-on experience, when it comes to things like the rota, things like allocations for certain surgeries. In a lot of corporate practices, it's very sort of clear cut,
mhm,
and that can be for a multitude of reasons, but it is mainly due to how much profit can we make.
mhm,
Whereas in an independent, there's a little bit more leniency and flexibility with the time that you're allowed to do things, and independence can have a massive impact on work-life balance, like you've just mentioned. Um, just anything from having an allocated time at the end of the day where the phones are off, can mean so much more, and you're not staying late having to do paperwork. Um,
or having to take that paperwork home.
exactly, having to take that paperwork home, and nobody likes to take work home. My partner feels the same way. If I'm bringing work home, she's definitely not very happy about it, and I think as a vet in a very, very stressful atmosphere, it's even more important because, if you're taking work home and you're bringing that stress home, it's not going to be a great environment, and you really
Mm,
sort of want to cut off at the end of the day.
yeah.
I think the teams, for the majority, are a lot closer knit. It's things like regular team outings. In a corporate practice, a team outing, you have to wait for corporate approval, which can take weeks. With independent practices, all you have to do is sort of ask the partner, or it might be the partner that's arranging it,
Mm,
and it can happen quite quickly. And with that sort of availability of management, it means if you do have any issues, you can go straight to the decision maker. You can go straight to the manager instead of having to go through departments and having to go through senior leaders who don't know what it's like on the ground floor. And usually they're less target driven atmospheres.
mm,
So it does make some independent practices a much more beneficial environment,
mm,
to some vets than corporates do. Don't get me wrong, some independents do really have some issues, and some corporates are fantastic. But I think for the vast majority of people who have worked in a corporate before, 9 out of 10 times they'll say that they prefer the independent atmosphere.
yeah. I've come across exactly the same thing. There's been, I think, probably one or two occasions from tens and hundreds of conversations whereby the corporate side of things is preferred, particularly by the more experienced vets. So I
Mhm.
know I've mentioned already in this podcast that you will come across some people, particularly new grads, who will really benefit from being in that larger corporate environment,
Yeah.
even if it's just for having the larger team around you for support. But once somebody gains that bit more experience and perhaps they want to pursue a bias or even go as far as a specialism, you get to this point where an independent practice, depending on the specific individual practice, can offer a lot more to the right person. And going off exactly
Mhm.
what you've mentioned there, I think the team factor that I often come across as being a really important part of why somebody is considering a new opportunity and might want to look for a new job. Um, it's certainly a big tick in the pros column for an independent practice.
Yes.
And don't get me wrong, it's not always a cross in the cons of a corporate, but yeah, it's certainly a factor that makes individual independent practices stand out for sure.
Certainly. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, I think that kind of covers our first question, Josh. So, thank you for that. Now, our second question, again, one that both you and I have come across,
Mhm.
is as a vet, should I pursue leadership or progress more clinically within my career? Again, Josh, if you're happy to start us off on this one, I'll chime in where needed.
Yeah, certainly. So I think I'll provide you with an open answer. It
Wonderful.
depends. It depends.
Mm,
You know, it's easy to feel that that's the way to progress. Um, you know, you'll see time and time again vets that are working at practices for long periods of time will go into leadership, and categorically, that's what you do in every role outside of veterinary. Um, you try and work up to be a manager and manage people. Now, with vets, it can be slightly different. I think that leadership isn't for everybody, and I'm seeing that a lot of vets who have gone into leadership are really struggling because they felt that it was the natural step,
mm,
um, but just don't like the people aspect of being a
mm,
manager. And being a manager is a lot more than just sort of making rotas. You've got a whole bunch of everybody else's life admin that you have to organize as a manager, and then you also have clinical time as well. Um, and I think that at corporate practices, especially, I'm finding that people are feeling a little bit like a punching bag when it
mm,
comes to the big people in big offices sort of shouting down orders at them. So they're a bit of a punching bag between the vets on the ground floor and the big bosses up top.
mm,
Um, if you're sort of confused about whether you're wanting to go into leadership or not, I would always recommend sort of dipping your toe in first before jumping into something fully. So you can always sort of experiment with going down a coaching route. A lot of vets that I know are GDP advisors and just wanted to try that aspect of management and sort of
mm,
being able to help people pursue their clinical interests but without having a clinical director title and having the freedom of also doing the clinical work that comes alongside. And I think, Kieran, that maybe at that point where you are wanting to progress more clinically and you're not able to do it within your current practice, you can always look at other options. I think working with somebody that's got a certificate or has done extensive CPD in any particular
hmm.
area
Yeah.
is always going to be a better environment than you trying to learn everything on your own. Um, and I think it can have a realm of benefits. You have somebody to discuss your cases with, rather than having to rely on Doctor Google or rely on Facebook groups and ask vets their opinions in there. What do you
Mm.
think?
I agree again with what you've said there. I think something else is about the right environment.
Hmm.
I know we've discussed previously about, somebody could move to an hospital environment, for example, and try some work there. Um, Look at pursuing some sort of specialism or bias, if that's something that would particularly of interest to them. I
Hmm.
think clinically as well, I've spoken to a number of mixed vets.
Hmm.
And what ends up happening is that they get to a point after a certain number of years, maybe 3 to 5 years of practicing, and they start to think, actually, I'd really rather pursue just one avenue.
Yeah.
Perfect example. I spoke to this wonderful equine vet only today, in fact, at the time of recording this, and had a lovely conversation with her. And she'd originally started off as a large animal and equine vet. So forgive me, farm animal and equine vet.
Hmm.
And as time's gone on, she's kind of gradually moved away from the farm animal side of things and is now much more focused on equine. But she's
Right.
still keeping a hand in with the farm animal, so she can still perform C-sections on cows, for example,
Hmm.
and do some of the important side of things without necessarily having to go to a farm every shift.
Hmm.
She can be dealing more with the equine, which is more of her passion. And I think
Yeah.
that's the beautiful thing about
Yeah.
the pursuit of different clinical aspects as a vet, because you can pursue various areas that you may have a greater interest in. And
It's never too late to change.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Never
And
too
going
late to
off what we
change.
discussed about the leadership side of things, this same vet, funnily enough, that whom I spoke with this morning, she gave me an example as to how in certain practices, it's almost as though that once you get to so many years of experience, if there's a retirement or somebody leaves the organization, particularly in a corporate environment, not so much independent, but
Mhm.
particularly in corporate, um, if a clinical director were to leave, for example, there's an element of pressure for you to want to take that role. You know, if
Mhm.
you've been there for a certain amount of time, you know the team, you know the ways things work. Um, but I think for some people, they don't want that. Whether they're experienced in that corporate environment or not, they don't want the pressure of, as you mentioned yourself, Josh, the people management or
Mhm.
the extra work that comes with it. I mean, I've spoken to a couple of clinical directors just this last month who want to move away from the clinical directorship just purely because of the amount of extra work that they're having to take home with them, which of
Yeah.
course, they want to avoid, or whether it's a case of having to do hours that they're not meant to be doing, so they're giving up, sacrificing their weekends and time with young families and things like that. And the leadership side of things, I think, brings with it more pressure,
Mhm.
whereas the clinical side of things, I think, depending on what you want to try and get out of having a career as a vet, you can pursue things more that interest you. I think there's more of an opportunity for pursuit of happiness, perhaps, for want of a better expression,
Mhm.
down the clinical side of things than there is necessarily the leadership. Whereas, as I say, there could be more of an element of pressure.
Mhm.
Um, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I think for a lot of people, leadership is a great option. It is a
Yeah,
really really good option, and just sort of touching on what you said about having to take work home. Um, i-
yeah,
if work life balance is something that's incredibly important to you, and a lot of vets that I'm speaking to, sort of within that 8 to 12 years qualified mark, and
mm,
sort of settling down, maybe starting a family, you've got to sort of sit back and think, is leadership for you?
mm,
Is it going to be able to provide you with the right work-life balance that means you can spend time with your family? Because more often than not, you are taking work home and you are doing those extra hours, and that's part and parcel of sort of being a manager.
absolutely.
Um, but if you want to develop more clinically and sort of go down a bit of a special interest route, then it's not as sort of taxing on your own time. And although you have a time limit, if you're doing a certificate, you can do it at your own pace, and you can sort of set your own caseload. And I think it's sort of the better option for people that are not married to the job, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think you've put that really well. Okay, wonderful. I think that rounds off our second question. So to finish on, this is a question that I think we can probably both agree we get more than any other.
Yeah.
Um, what's the advantage of working with Menlo Park over other agencies?
Mhm.
So, if you don't mind, Josh, I'll take this one just to start, and then I'll hand
Sure.
over to you. So,
Sure.
when we're asked this, I think it's because vets. I'm sure if you're a veterinary professional listening to this episode, um, first off, thank you for listening, and secondly, I'm sure you're used to hearing from agencies. Um, Wanting to speak to you, wanting to try and sell you this wonderful job they've just taken on and pitch the hell out of this wonderful um, opportunity that they're certain you'll love.
Mhm.
But how can they do that if they've not spoken with you first? So yeah, okay, then some of them might have got in touch and said, okay, what salary do you want? How far will you commute? What hours can you do?
Yeah.
Okay, that's three questions. That's not really getting to know somebody.
What's your
Now,
salary expectations?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Whereas working with Menlo Park, and anybody who's listening to this who's spoken with myself or Josh, um, or even if you're open to, we are unlike anybody else because we take the time to know and understand anybody that we deal with. So we're not just speaking to you about a few quick questions. We're not contacting you about a job as the first port of call. What we want to do as specialists in our field is have an open, transparent, exploratory chat with you to learn what you want from a role. It's all well and good us contacting you and saying, "Oh, I've got this fantastic opportunity. It's so many miles from you. It's
Mhm.
it's X amount of CPD. This is the salary." But how do we know if that's worth your time if we've never spoken to you properly before?
Mhm.
So for us, what's key is making sure we know exactly what you want. And I'm not just talking salary and hours and such, but what do you want from a job? What do you want your day to day to look like?
Mhm.
What do you want as an opportunity to progress with? What would interest you in terms of CPD opportunities? Would you like leadership? Would you like the opportunity to develop in any particular area?
Mhm.
And then we proactively get out there and find that role for you. So we're not getting in touch, as I say, with a job in the first instance, but we will find something that is worth your time listening to us about. Because too often, I think vets can take these calls from other agencies and they lose 10 minutes maybe
Mhm.
talking to somebody who's doesn't really know what they want. They're just pitching a job and hoping that it's going to pique some interest.
Yeah.
However, when we get in touch with you about a job, we know that it will interest you. We know that it's something that you are wanting to hear about because it'll tick the right boxes that you've laid out for us. That's the difference. And that's why when we help somebody secure a position, it's for a long term role, one that we know will tick the right boxes for them. And
Mhm.
we also know that they are right for what the practice is looking for.
Yeah.
So, Josh, can you add to that? Do you think I've missed anything there necessarily?
No, not at all. I think that it's a better way of doing things. And
Absolutely.
I touched on when I introduced myself that we work with vets who are fully committed to doing things a better way and
Yes.
are prioritizing self development and self improvement. So even if it's as little as you're not unhappy in your current role, but there's something that you feel that you're missing. Having a conversation and just finding out our advice as sort of first point of call is always going to be beneficial. And I always say to people who a question that I get is, why is it so long? Why is the process and why are our conversations so detailed? And what I always answer with is, it's your career, it's your life. Why would you put your trust in somebody that's going to not take very many details and know a lot about you,
Mm,
in the hope of making some form of placement? um, with us, yes, it can seem tedious on a first off, and we're going into a lot of detail and we're asking some personal questions, but that's because we only want to match you with a role that is going to fit you down to the ground. It's going to
exactly.
be the best thing possible that you're looking for. And at the end of the day, if we don't think that we can help, we're going to let you know,
Mm,
because we do want it to be a good use of your time. We're not here to waste anybody's time. But
absolutely.
if we can help and we can really get to the nooks and crannies of exactly what it is that drives you and where you see yourself going in the future, then we can for sure sort of conduct a manual search rather than having practices that we are trying to hire for actively.
Mm,
Um, and it means that any practice we put you into and we tell you to go and have a chat with is going to be an exact fit. It's
mm,
it's not going to be a waste of your time. And I think that's a key point as to why we sort of go into all of this detail, is so we don't waste your time, we don't want to waste our time, and we definitely don't want to waste a practice's time either. So finding the good fit, like a key in a keyhole, is ideal.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head with that, Josh, when you mentioned about really getting to the minutiae of detail. And yes, we do ask some personal questions, but it's because, again, as Josh has so rightly said, this is your career, and it's not just you that this is affecting. It's
Hmm.
also the family around you, or it's the friends that you want to have the work life balance to have time to go and see. So we will ask a number of questions, but it's because we seek to understand. We're not here to just throw the first job at you that comes up on our radar. It is about finding that right fit. So it is breaking things down to the nitty gritty. And I don't know if you've had this, Josh, but I've had a couple of people say, "Well, why do you need to know that?"
Hmm.
In answer to, I might ask a couple of different questions, and they say, "Well, why do you need to know that?" And when I explain why, they are more kind of, "Oh, that's different.
Taken aback
Okay,
a bit. Yeah.
yeah."
Yeah.
Um, and so far, our conversations have led to people finding their dream jobs. And that's what we want to do. It's not just about the first role, which I know I keep repeating, but it's because I'm really trying to get that point home, because that is what other agencies will do. They're looking for that quick fix for a practice that's not really a long-term option for either party, be that the practice or the vet. Whereas we want to help the vet in the first instance find the right practice, and by doing so, that practice has got the right vet. So then it's hopefully a long-term marriage that works for everybody. Um, so you can tell that we're passionate about this. I hope our listeners. It's something that we both care about greatly. So
It
um,
is.
is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Josh, before we wrap up this episode one?
No, I think you've covered it very nicely, Kieran.
Oh, God, you're too kind. You're too kind. Um, so, folks, thank you. If you have got this far in the episode, thank you for taking the time to listen to myself and Josh. I hope that our answering of these questions and going into them with you a little bit has either helped you answer these questions yourself, or even if it's to kind of give you the nudge to give us a call. Please do feel free to get in touch rather with any of the details on our socials. That you can find us in all the usual places: LinkedIn, Facebook. You can find us on menloparkrecruitment.com. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to us. Josh, thank you ever so much for making the time to speak to me. I know this was a little bit of a last minute
Thank you.
arrangement,
Thank
but
you.
thank
It's
you for
been
joining me. I
lovely.
hope you'll join me on another episode one day.
Of course.
Um, and
Of
yeah,
course.
thank you very much for listening. Take care.
Thank you.